Okay, so let's start, and others can join us later. My name is Doron, and I'm very happy and proud to be here and to speak to you. Um, Here in Israel, it's afternoon, 7 o'clock. I guess that in other places in the world, it's different time. I'm trying and mute everyone. Okay, that's better. Um, I would like to put on my presentation first, and please let me know if you can see it. Is it okay? Can you see it? Okay, great. So as you can see, I will speak today about the holy places, Jerusalem holy places, between 1948 and 1967, between these two very important wars. And I will speak about a very special time period, the days between Passover and Shavuot. That's exactly the time when we are now, and about the uniqueness of holy space in Jerusalem between 1948 and 1967. I want to start by saying thank you. I know that many of you are supporters of the Schechter Institute for many, many years, and this is a very good opportunity for me to thank you for your support. And I think that what we are doing here in Israel is crucial, is important, spreading the word of Jewish pluralism. Today, as I said, I will speak about Jerusalem's holy places. It will be, I think, a talk of, I would say, 30 minutes or 45 minutes, and then we'll give some time for you if you want to ask me something, or maybe we can make a kind of a discussion about this topic. I want to first, say a few words about myself. As you can hear from my accent, I was born in Israel, and I'm a 7th or 6th generation in Jerusalem. My family came to Jerusalem already during the early stages of the 19th century and settled in the old city of Jerusalem, and then later moved to the new parts of Jerusalem. So I'm very proud of this, and I think it has to do with what I'm doing right now. Besides being the president of the Schechter Institute, I'm also a professor of history and geography. And these are some of my books, the books that I published. I'm very much interested on the connections, the ties between space and time, geography and history, and of course, the cultural, historical geography of Eretz Israel and the state of Israel, and of course, Jerusalem. I teach about Jerusalem. My students are going around the city in tours that I conduct. And this is part of what we do in Schechter. So I will speak today about something that I think is quite unique. I started to speak a little bit about this time period during the year and those seven weeks between Passover and Shavuot. And you can see very clearly how much the Israelis are connected, especially during this time of the year, are connected to places, sacred places. I'm speaking not only about the Western Wall, and the connection between the Western Wall, its history, the location of the temple, Passover, Shavuot, the mitzvah of pilgrimage. So I'm not speaking only about the Western Wall. By the way, you can see here on the left, you can see how the Western Wall looks like today. Because of the corona, they divided it not only between men and women, but actually between men and women and women. This is, of course, to confront the issue of the corona virus. So people are still praying there. So going back to the issue of holy places during this time of the year, I'm not only speaking about religious, traditional, popular holy places. I'm also speaking about national holy places. And this time of the year in Israel, this is a very special period because we are not only celebrating, we are also remembering. And I'm speaking about, of course, the Holocaust Day that we commemorated only a week ago, and Yad Vashem, of course. And we also commemorated the fallen soldiers. And it's very interesting to see that the commemoration day, the evening of the commemoration day, the special ceremony takes place in front of the Western Wall. This is something that was formed after 1967, after the victory in the Six-Day War, and there's this kind of a connection between the Jewishness and Israeliness of the place. So this is another place where you can see the strong ties between the Israelis and places. And of course, the Independence Day. Israel's Independence Day. Only last week, we celebrated Israel's Independence Day. Of course, under the reality of the corona. So as you know, usually Israelis are frequenting, visiting Mount Herzl, and we are celebrating there the opening ceremony of the Independence Day. But this year we could not do that. And of course, Jerusalem Day. Jerusalem Day that will take place in Kafchet in Iyar in a few days from now, next week, I think. And again, you can see very clearly the connections, the strong ties that Israelis have to places, sacred places. I wrote, by the way, an article to the local newspapers, and I wrote about this issue and about these ties, and I tried to explain why is it so important, why it became so important for the Israelis to frequent these holy places and make pilgrimage not only to the Old City and to the Western Wall, but also to Yad Vashem and Mount Herzl. So I want to turn now to speak about history and about the period between 1948 and 1967 and about Jerusalem during these two wars, the War of Independence and the Six-Day War. And you can see very clearly from the map that I show you now that during these 19 years, Jerusalem underwent a very important and unprecedented situation. Jerusalem was divided into two parts. And in the western part of Jerusalem, in the left part of the map, you can see very clearly Israeli Jerusalem. On the eastern part of the dividing wall of the green line, you can see the old city. And this section of the city was, of course, governed by the Jordanians. Now, the division of the city into two parts created a new reality in Jerusalem. The western part of Jerusalem was developed into the capital city of Israel. And we will have to ask ourselves, how do you develop a capital city? What should be part of a capital city? An Israeli capital city, a Jewish capital city? What should it be in Jerusalem after 1948? And there's another thing that I want to emphasize, and that's the detachment from many of the popular, historical, mythological holy places that were now, after 1948, were now behind the enemy lines, unreachable to most of the Jewish Israelis who lived in the western parts of Jerusalem and, of course, the rest of Israel. And I claim that this reality, the detachment from those historical holy places, created an opportunity to develop Western Jerusalem as a holy city. And I will speak mainly about two places. I hope that we will have enough time. One of them is Mount Zion and King David's tomb, that before 1948 was unreachable to the Jews of Jerusalem. The place was kept by the Muslims, and they prevented any visits of Jews there. After the War of Independence, after 1948, King David's tomb was developed into Israel's most important Jewish holy site. And the connection between Jerusalem, King David, the first king of Jerusalem, and the Israelis was very, very strong. And you can see here some of the photos that I will present later. And the other place that I will speak about its history is Mount Herzl. And by the way, I want to emphasize, when we speak about Mount Herzl, I think there is a kind of a mixture amongst the Israelis about what is Mount Herzl. Mount Herzl is actually composed of at least 3 or 4 parts. It's not only the place where Herzl is buried. It's also the place where the soldiers are buried. I'm speaking about the military cemetery of Mount Herzl, which is located on the slopes of the mountain. And there is, of course, the section where the politicians, the leaders, our pantheon, the Israeli pantheon, is located, where Yitzhak Rabin is buried. You can see it very clearly here in this photo. So I will speak about these two sites, King David's tomb on Mount Zion and Mount Herzl, and the reburial of Binyamin Ze'ev Herzl, Theodor Herzl, in this place. Please pay attention that we speak about 2 mountains, holy places, mountains, pilgrimage, Aliyah LaRegel. There is a connection between these 2 sites. One of them is a Zionist Israeli holy site, and the other one is a traditional Jewish holy site. And before I speak about Mount Herzl, I want to say a few sentences about the reality in Jerusalem before 1948, before the War of Independence, before the division of the land of Israel into two parts. And you remember, I'm speaking today about holy places, holy sites. So when we look at the map of holy sites in Jerusalem, Jewish holy sites in Jerusalem before 1948, where there were a lot of Jewish holy places. There was, of course, the Western Wall, and you can see the very small plaza in front of the Western Wall, and there were additional holy places in Jerusalem. Most of them were sacred tombs, where the Jews of Jerusalem and the Jews of Israel and the Jews of the diaspora made a pilgrimage and visited them. There were also additional holy places like the Cave of the Machpelah in Hebron. You can see an old photo of Hebron during the 19th century. By the way, the Jews were not allowed to get inside of the Cave of the Patriarchs. They were praying outside of this impressive building. There is, of course, Rachel's tomb on the way to Bethlehem, which was a very important Jewish holy site, and many Jews visited this place. And there's also the traditional place where Samuel, the prophet Samuel, was buried next to Jerusalem. These are only a few examples to how wide and varied was the map of holy places, Jewish holy places, not only in Jerusalem, but actually also in other places in the land of Israel. What about Zionist holy places before 1948? Were there Zionist, Israeli, Hebrew, Jewish holy places in Jerusalem before 1948? Were not many. One of the more important such holy places was the Hebrew University. It was a third temple. That's what was written about the Hebrew University. And you can see the opening ceremony of the Hebrew University in April 1925. It was a big event. It was like the creation of a new Jewish Zionist holy place in Jerusalem. Most of the holy places in Jerusalem, as I said, were traditional Jewish holy places, but there were few Zionist holy places. And the reason for that was that the relationship between the Zionist movement and Jerusalem were not so clear and forward. The Zionist movement saw Jerusalem as a complex city with many problems, with Muslim and Christian holy places. And it took time for the Zionist movement to see its way towards Jerusalem and its development. So this was the reality until 1948. But everything changed when, during the War of Independence, Western Jerusalem, at least Western Jerusalem, was divided. Jerusalem was divided, and the western part of Jerusalem, as I said, was turned into the official capital of the newborn state. And I asked you earlier, what should it be in such a city? Which institutes should there be in such a city as Jerusalem, Jewish Israeli Jerusalem? And it was clear for the leaders of Israel that it's not enough that the government offices will be in Jerusalem, that the Knesset will be in Jerusalem, that the Supreme Court will be located in Jerusalem. They clearly understood that Jerusalem needs Zionist Israeli symbols. And one of the more important symbols was Mount Herzl, and the bringing of his bones, his remains from Vienna, and his reburial in August 1949 in the summit of the highest mountain in Western Jerusalem. You can see the arrow that marks the location of this mountain, Mount Herzl. So I want to speak a little bit about the long way that Herzl remains made until on 17th of August 1949, he was buried for the second time in Jerusalem. So the story starts on July 1904, when Benjamin Zev Herzl told her Herzl passed away in the city of Vienna. He was only 44 when he passed away, when he died. It was a big shock, of course, for the Jewish world, for the Zionist world. He had they didn't know how to proceed from then on, but David Wolfson, as you know, continued his way. When his last will was opened, he wrote his last will on the beginning of the 20th century, about a year before he passed away. They could see that he left there quite unusual, exceptional, and important request. He writes there in his last will, "I wish to be buried in a metal coffin in the cemetery plot next to my father." That's the central cemetery in the city of Vienna. "And I will lie there until the people of Israel transfer my body to the land of Israel." This is his request. And later he continues to speak about the rest of his family. This is something exceptional and very, very strong. Herzl thinks about the creation of the Jewish state. And he emphasized that he wants himself to be buried again somewhere, as you can see, in the land of Israel. He doesn't say specifically where he wants to be reburied. And indeed, after his burial in Vienna, his tomb was turned into a very important Zionist pilgrimage site. We have lots of wonderful photos, as you can see. Many of them are treasured in the Zionist archive in Jerusalem. And we know from many photos and many testimonies that Jews, European Jews, German Jews, Austrian Jews, it was their habit to visit the tomb and think about the fulfillment of his wish to be reburied in the land of Israel. And indeed, during many of the Zionist congresses, during the 1920s and 1930s, there were many discussions about the right way to fulfill Herzl's last wish. Many of the debates, of the discussions, were around the question where Herzl should be buried in Palestine, in Eretz Israel. It was not yet, of course, the state of Israel. The people of Haifa thought that Herzl wanted to be reburied in Haifa. And they thought that he left a kind of a clue in his book, Alt-Leuland. So Haifa was one candidate for that. Tel Aviv also was another place that was possible. And there in Tel Aviv, we had a very important figure like Meir Dizengoff, the mayor of Tel Aviv, and he claimed that Herzl should be buried in the first Jewish city, in Tel Aviv. Jerusalem had the weakest point. And as I told you, the connection, the ties between the Zionist movement and Jerusalem were at the beginning quite weak. In Jerusalem, Menachem Osishkin, the head of the Keren Kayemet Israel, was a big supporter of the idea to bring the remains of Herzl to Jerusalem and to bury him on top of the Mount of Scopus, next to the Hebrew University, this holy place that I've mentioned, and to bury his remains in the second temple, Nicanor's cave. Those of you who visited the Hebrew University surely know this wonderful cave, part of the botanical garden of the Hebrew University. So there were a few options where Herzl should be buried. And again, I'm expressing this, it was before 1948. And then came, of course, the War of Independence. Then came the Declaration of Independence in Hey Be'iyar, and you can see the very famous picture of David Ben-Gurion and the Declaration of Independence. And then came the decision, as I told you, that Jerusalem will be the capital of the newborn state. Not Tel Aviv, not Haifa, not any place else, but Jerusalem, because it's symbolicity. And then, of course, it was clear to all of them that Herzl's last will should be fulfilled quickly, strongly, and it should be Jerusalem that will be his final place of rest. I'm speaking now about the end of 1948, the beginning of 1949, and the arrows that you see in front of you are possible locations that they thought about when they looked for a proper place in Jerusalem to bury him. But quite quickly, they decided that the mountain on the western part of the city, the highest mountain on the western part of the city, what will be later called Mount Herzl, it is the best location, the only possible location to bury Herzl there. And the reason for that was only the height of the mountain and the visibility, the clear view that Herzl will have to all the Israelis, and the fact that all the Israelis symbolically will be able to see Herzl and his grave, of course. So I'm now jumping to August 1949. And you can see here the Knesset at the beginning of August is taking the law of retirement of Herzl. They decide that Herzl will be buried in Israel, in Jerusalem. And the ceremony starts, of course, in Vienna. And you can see the wonderful pictures that were kept all throughout these years in the Zionist archive. I curated a new exhibition that commemorated 70 years to the reinterment of Benjamin Ze'ev Herzl. We celebrated this year 70 years, and we found these wonderful pictures of the funeral and his last voyage to Jerusalem. And you can see the way they took Herzl's coffin from the family plot in the cemetery. You can see how the coffins of him and his family are carried from the cemetery. You can see the ceremonies that took place in Vienna. And I'm speaking not only about Vienna's synagogue, but also the concert hall, the central concert hall of Vienna. And please think about the following point. Only 5 years ago, or 10 years ago, Vienna was the site where the Nazis ruled. They, of course, expelled the Jewish community from Vienna. They did horrible things. And here, with a lot of pride, the Jews of Vienna and Austria are assembling and giving away sending the remains of Herzl to the representatives of the newborn state. And indeed, those who carried back Herzl's remains, Herzl's family remains, were not only the pilots of El Al plane. You can see how this plane bears the name Herzl on his nose. But there were also IDF officers, Tsahal's officers, who were sent by the government to Vienna to receive, to take back the remains of Herzl. And this is the ceremony that takes place in Vienna's airport before the plane takes off and returns to Israel. And in Israel, as you can see, big excitement. You can see the headings of all the newspapers who are celebrating this event. And there are many assemblies and lectures on the evening before the arrival of Herzl's remains to Israel. In Haifa, the people of Haifa were quite, they expected that the plane will land next to their city and that the voyage, the funeral will pass through Haifa, but there was a kind of disappointment. And here you can see the people of Haifa standing on the tops of their houses and looking how the plane passes above their heads, of course. And then here is the plane with the coffins of the family landing in Lad airport, and the ceremony that takes place there. It's very interesting to understand that instead of taking the coffin straight to Jerusalem, to Mount Herzl, it was taken first to Tel Aviv. People demanded to have the right to pass by the remains of Herzl. There was a big demand for that. And that was the reason why the coffin was first taken to Tel Aviv. And those of you who know Tel Aviv may recognize the place. That's the end of Allenby Street, next to the Tayelet, next to the shore, to the walkway, the Opera Square. And here the casket of Binyamin Ze'ev Herzl is presented in front of the people of Tel Aviv and the rest of the country. As you can see, thousands and thousands of people assembled to take part in this ceremony. And then, of course, the way to Jerusalem. Big excitement. People are waiting from the two sides of the road. Again, look at the picture on the left. I think that many of you took this road, this way, connecting Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. And this is the place where the road to even today is climbing towards the castle. And you can see today it's of course a big highway, but in 1949 it was a very narrow road, of course, and you can see the convoy making its way towards Jerusalem, the entrance to Jerusalem, and again, not yet Mount Herzl. The coffin, Herzl's coffin, was located inside of the National Institute building, in the plaza right at the heart of this building. And again, it was a way to present the Jerusalemites, the people of Jerusalem that were not invited to the ceremony on Mount Herzl. It was a time for them to pass in front of Herzl's casket and pay tribute to him. And only then, and again, we speak about August 17 in the afternoon, very hot, a very hot day. Only then the casket was taken to Mount Herzl. It was a traditional Jewish ceremony, a traditional Jewish funeral, but with lots of soldiers, activity, lots of symbols. For example, I can give you the following example. There were 44 Israeli flags hanging around the tomb. And the reason was, of course, that, as I told you, Herzl passed away on the age of 44. That was the reality around this number. So you can see in front of you the IDF Honor Guard, different units, and the time now is 5:15, I think, in the afternoon. The local radio, Jerusalem's radio, sounds a special voice that tells the people of Israel that they should now stand still. It was impossible, of course, for all the Israelis to take part in this ceremony, but it was a kind of a uniting moment where everyone stopped and took part in the funeral, the second funeral of Benjamin Ze'ev Herzl. And there was another very interesting issue, another interesting thing. Look at those chalutzim, look at those pioneers, and look what they are holding in their hands. They are holding small bags of soil that were brought from more than 300 Jewish settlements around the country, from Dgania, from Tel Aviv, from Hanita, from various places in the newborn state. They came to take part in the ceremony, and when the casket was lowered down, they covered it symbolically and practically with the soil of the land of Israel, of Eretz Israel. This is a very strong Zionist Israeli act that was done during this funeral. A few days later, by the way, Herzl's family were buried inside Mount Herzl, but next to his tomb, and you can see the location of the family plot again in Mount Herzl. Quite after the reburial of Herzl, the place was turned into a place of pilgrimage, a very important symbolical place. And although the picture is not very good, in 1949, for example, all the citizens of Jerusalem made a pilgrimage, made a visit to Mount Herzl against the threat to make Jerusalem an international city. And the Israelis, the Jerusalem people said, no way. And they came to swear next to Herzl's tomb, quite, I would say, symbolically. Right after the funeral, there was a debate. How should we develop Mount Herzl? How should we structure Mount Herzl? How should we plan architecturally? How should we structure such an important tomb as the tomb of Herzl? At the beginning, as you can see, the only thing that covered Herzl's tomb were flowers and a symbolical tombstone saying that in the future, something will be built on top of his tomb. But there was big debate, there were many debates about the future of the place. Should it be a monumental building like the one that was built in Moscow? I'm speaking about Lenin Mausoleum. And we have many examples in other places of the world where leaders, where thinkers, where philosophers were buried. Or should it be a modest place connected to the Jewish tradition, of not building monumental buildings. This was another option. At the beginning of the 1950s, the Zionist movement decided to have a competition for the development, for the planning of Mount Herzl. And as you can see, this was one of the plans for the design of Mount Herzl. But in 1951, architect Yosef Klarwein was decided, he was elected, his plan was elected to be the one that he will be the one that will develop and build Mount Herzl. And he planned to build a huge dome on top of Herzl's tomb with 44 pillars. And right at the heart of it, Herzl's tomb was supposed to be built. You know, of course, that this dome was never built. And the reason for that was that they understood not only money, not only bureaucratic issues, but mainly their understanding that this dome will destroy everything. That the clear view that we have, the wonderful landscape that we have around us, this is the most important thing in Mount Herzl. And in 1960, as you probably know, the temporary tombstone was replaced by this black marker, and the occasion was 100 years to the birth of Binyamin as Herzl. So I have a few more minutes, and I want to speak a little bit about the other holy place that I've mentioned, and that's King David's tomb on Mount Zion. And this is, of course, a completely different approach to or view of holy places. And this is, of course, a traditional biblical holy places. And that's David's tomb on Mount Zion. As I told you, until 1948, the Jews were not allowed to visit the place. But during the War of Independence, everything was changed. The old city was taken over by the Jordanians, but Mount Zion with David's tomb on top of it was part of Jewish Western Jerusalem. And the place was right immediately adopted by the Ministry of Religions. And it was turned quite quickly to a central, important Jewish holy place. You can see the many Jewish items that were located on the traditional tomb. You can see the decorations, you can see the writings in Hebrew, and quite immediately, the place started to attract masses and masses of Israelis. Many of them prayed, Bashana haba b'Yerushalayim habnua, next year in build up Jerusalem. But when they came to Jerusalem as Olim Chadashim, as new immigrants, well, Jerusalem was divided and they were not able to visit the Western Wall and the other places. So King David's tomb was a kind of a substitute for them, and they visited it with masses. It was a place, it was not only King David's tomb, but actually also a kind of a museum. You can see, for example, items that were brought from other holy places in the territories that were occupied by the Jordanians, and many ceremonies, many holidays, many Jewish holidays, Chagim, were celebrated next to David's tomb. You can see Hanukkah, for example, with these pictures of lighting up the Chanukiah. Kids visited the place, the blessing of the child, as you can see. And the place was even part of the VIPs, the very important people that visited Jerusalem during this time. And they also visited not only Mount Herzl, but also Mount Zion and King David's tomb that was turned into a very important site. It was a place actually where you could come and look to the other side of the city. There was a a lot of interest of what goes on in the other part of Jerusalem, what goes on in the Western Wall, what goes on in the Temple Mount. And it was a kind of an observation point to the other side of the city. And here are my concluding remarks with these very famous pictures of the Six-Day War and the capture of the old city and the huge change that took place in the Western Wall. Look how important is this picture of the Western Wall at the beginning of July 1967, only 2 or 3 weeks after the war. And look how many people, how many Israelis are visiting the place. Look how men and women are celebrating together. Look how religious and non-religious people are dancing together. And this situation quite quickly was changed by the regulations made by the Ministry of Religion and the separation between the two sexes and other things that were done in the Western Wall. By the way, a book of mine about this issue will appear hopefully during the coming year in both English and Hebrew. It's a book about the Western Wall after 1967 and the things that happened there after the war, following the war. So I spoke about Jewish holy places, Zionist holy places, and the mixture between these places. And I suggest that we'll stop now and give some time for remarks or questions or debate, something that you want to add. I'm unmuting everyone, and if you want to add something, please let me know.
Hmm? Oh, I got it said not now.
Any questions? Remarks?
If I could ask a question, I was interested to know that he designated, Herzl did, a metal casket. When he came to Israel, was it substituted for a wooden casket or no casket as the tradition is now?
I think, as far as I remember, it was a wooden casket. And I can recheck it by looking at these pictures, but I think it was a wooden casket. It's, it's quite exceptional in the Jewish tradition.
Right.
But it was quite common when you look at the habits of the Jews of Europe, of Central Europe. It was quite common to be buried in the metal casket. And maybe, of course, Herzl's family thought about his request to be reburied in the land of Israel. That's the reason why they put him in such a casket.
Okay.
At the time of the reburial, there's a picture on the left side. It appears to be bones. Were those Herzl's bones?
Absolutely, yes. It's terrifying. It's amazing to see that. But again, you can get inside the website of the Zionist archive, and you could see it by yourselves. These are photos that are presented there, and you can see all the funeral, starting from the removal of the bones from his tomb, and of course later the voyage to Jerusalem. So these are his remains. Absolutely.
Thank you very much for sharing this.
Sorry?
Thank you very much for sharing this.
Sure. Okay. But any more questions or remarks?
What happened to Herzl's grave after the Anschluss?
Yeah. Well, people say a miracle. But actually nothing happened to the tomb. There are some rumors about a kind of that the Zionist movement tried to be in contact with the Nazis and to buy his remains and to remove them, to bring them to Israel. But I doubt it. I don't think it's true. I think that the Nazis, I don't know what was the reason for that, but they decided to leave not only Herzl's tomb, but actually the entire section where there was a Jewish cemetery. You know, it's part of the general cemetery of Vienna. They decided to leave it as it is and not to harm this. So in my book, I write about the surprise after the war when people returned to the cemetery and saw that nothing happened to the tomb.
You said that Yosef Klarwein's plan was never implemented.
Can I say something?
Just a minute, a question about Klarwein, yeah, please.
Yes, so his plan was never implemented. Who's responsible for the development of...
One person at a
Someone is
time.
asking about Yosef Klarwein. Please, can you be... Those of you who are not asking, can you mute yourself?
Having met her grandmother about 5 years ago, it must have been.
I'm having trouble getting through.
We met very briefly at a hotel where Mrs. Bittman stayed with.
Guys, can you mute yourself?
And I just remember the elegance and that sense of dignity and self-respect that Mrs. Bittman emanated. And she was well dressed, and she was beautiful, and she smelled like.
Okay, the question about Klarwein, if you can repeat.
Yes, Klarwein, you said Klarwein won the competition, but his plan was never implemented. Who might be responsible for the development of Mount Herzl, because it's clearly been developed since 1960?
Well, actually, he was the one who developed Mount Herzl, but not Herzl's tomb. He did a lot of gardening, as you know, some of you know the place and you visited the place. So he did a lot of gardening there. And things were built there. The gates to the mountain, the historical museum. Some of you, I'm sure, visited the old museum with his writing desk. So things were done there, but they understood that the actual tomb should not be changed. And Klarwein was the architect who designed the tomb, the black tombstone that you know. He was in charge of that.
Right.
So it was a kind of a solution for the problematic issue that happened. By the way, some of you may know that Klarwein was the architect who designed the building of the Knesset, the Israeli parliament. He was also in charge of that. And again, there was a lot of pressure on him to change the original plans.
But there's a major structure on Mount Herzl now. Who's responsible for that major structure that's there?
What do you mean major structure? The opening gates?
Yeah, I mean, and I was there recently, and there's like major. They say a special prayers every day or something for fallen soldiers, and there's a major building.
I understand what you mean. Okay, this is not part of Mount. This is not part of Mount Herzl. This is part of the military cemetery. And there's a difference between the different parts of Mount Herzl. As I said at the beginning, we have Mount Herzl, we have the military cemetery, and we have the Greats of the Nation section where presidents and prime ministers are buried. And today I spoke only about Mount Herzl, the place where Herzl is buried specifically.
Okay. I couldn't connect with you. I didn't have my audio working, so I missed that piece. Okay.
It's okay. Okay. Any questions?
Why isn't there a more intense push to make Yom Ha'atzmaut and Yom Jerusalem a religious holiday?
I'm amazed that he's alive.
I'm not sure I understood the question. Can you repeat this?
Why is they're more of an intense push to make your mouth and your Jerusalem a religious holiday.
Okay, I understand. I think that the question was why. I think that the question was why were the Independence Day and Jerusalem Day have until today, I think, a mixture of religious Jewish issues and Israeli tradition. And I think it happened. I think it happened gradually along the years. At the beginning, Jerusalem Day was a celebration in front of the Western Wall, a combination of religious Jewish newborn tradition with Zionist Israeli motives. And as you know, today more and more it became a religious ceremony that takes place in front of the Western Wall. Independence Day, it's interesting. On the eve of the commemoration day for the fallen soldiers, the ceremony starts in front of the Western Wall. On the night after, it goes to Mount Herzl in front of Herzl's tomb. So we have this very unique combination between old and new, Jewish and Zionist, etc. Any more questions? Okay, so thank you very much. Thank you very much. And I hope we'll meet again in the near future, maybe for another lecture. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Yeah. You have a break, coffee break for your classes?
We'd love to.
Yeah, the speakers are allowed in the building.
Coffee must be allowed in the bedroom.